Hello everyone, thank you for coming today to Vancouver Word 2022, Motives and Mysteries. I'm going to try not to speak much today because I got three fantastic BC writers today, some of the best mystery writers that Canada has to offer. So if you have any questions live, I'm going to open it up to you pretty much anytime you have a question. We'll go to you. We'll have some short readings today, but mostly let's just hear from these three great authors. But let me give you the official introduction. So please feel free, if you're live attending this event, to visit outside of the foyer. If you're a fan of mystery, Crime Writers of Canada has a table near the front. We'd love to chat with you. There's being manned by some BC authors today that are fantastic and fun to talk to. But also feel free to visit Iron Dog and all the other tables. Make an event of this. It's so fun to be actually at a live event. I've done so many virtual events in the last 2 years. It's a pleasure and maybe a little nerve-wracking actually seeing people out there, not just tiny little squares. I'd like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. We'd like to acknowledge that the festival itself takes place on the unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Slave Cuts people. Word Vancouver would like to thank, we just heard them before, but thank our sponsors and generous donors, the Canada Arts Council, the Canada Book Fund, the Canada Heritage Fund, Canada Periodical Fund, BC Arts Council, BC Gaming, Creators BC, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, Crime Writers of Canada, the Federation of BC Writers, the Canadian Poets, and sorry, it's a really long list, I'll stop there, but thank you to everyone who sponsored this event. We couldn't have done it without you. So let me introduce the three guests that we have today. So let's start going this way. Charles Demers is a comedian, author, and voice actor based in Vancouver. One of Canada's top stand-up comedians, he's also a regular performer on CBC Radio's The Debaters, which probably you've all heard of. At least I hope you have. He's one of the stars of the Emmy-winning Netflix animated series Beat Bugs, based on the immortal music of the Beatles, and a favorite in my house was of Teenage Boys, The Last Kids on Earth. His iTunes Canada #1 best-selling stand-up album, Fatherland, from 604 Records, was nominated for the 2018 Juno Awards for Best Comedy Album. It's really cool that we could change hats and also write mysteries. His most recent mystery novel, or his first mystery novel, Primary Obsessions, debuted on the BC bestseller list and was a finalist for the 2021 Dutty Booksellers' Choice Awards. His new book, the sequel, book called Noonday Dark, features the amateur sleuth detective Dr. Anik Boudreau. Thank you. Iona Whishaw grew up in Canada, Arizona, and Mexico. With an MFA from UBC, she's published short story, poetry, children's literature, and is the winner of the 2021 Bonnie Blythe Life Mystery Award and a nominee for the Duffy Book Prize and Lefty Awards. Her 10th book in the series, Framed in Fire, was released in April of 2022. She has a passion for history, and her family's World War II intelligence works informed the spirit of the period novels. And your main character sort of borrows from that.
Yes, thank you.
Has a very colorful past. Sam Wiebe, I tell everybody this, so I'll say officially, Sam Wiebe's my favorite writer, so I'm always happy to be interviewing him.
Hey,
he's the award-winning.
You're my favorite moderator.
So it works. The award-winning author of the Wakeland novels, one of the most authentic and acclaimed detective series in Canada, including Invisible Dead, Cut You Down, and Helen Gone. Wiebe's other books included Never Going Back, Last of the Independents, and Vancouver Noir Anthology, which he edited. Wiebe's work has won the Crime Writers of Canada Award and the Kobo Emerging Writers Prize, and has been shortlisted for the Edgar, Hammett, Seamus, and the City of Vancouver Book Prizes. And it just doesn't mention it there, but you won a couple of Crime Writers of Canada Awards too, haven't you?
Yes, it does mention that.
Nerves. So today our panel is called Motives and Mysteries. I thought we'd focus on the motives. What motivates your protagonists, what motivates your criminal masterminds, and also what motivates you. We're also going to pepper in some readings, and if you have any questions, raise your hands, and we'll go to, I'll ask your questions before I ask mine. So there's no hands up, so I'm going to ask mine. Let's start with your protagonist. 2 out of 3 of you have amateur sleuths. I'll start with you because you have 10 books where your amateur sleuth just keeps getting yourselves into trouble. What motivates Lane to constantly pursue these crimes? And often she gets herself in quite a lot of trouble, and she keeps doing it again and again. So why doesn't she keep doing it?
Thank you for the question. Lane is a retired intelligence officer from the SOE, which was disbanded right after the war. And so she did, war work at a very intense level. So, she would parachute into France to bring weapons or new gizmos that she would then show people on the ground how to use, or she'd bring messages or whatever. And so she was in a category of women who, after the war, did not stay on spying, but nevertheless had these very intense experiences, and many of them just sort of got married and receded into the background. They couldn't even tell their husbands what they did, and their husbands just thought, the little woman is pretty smart, but she is a woman. And so, you have this kind of burning energy around your capacity and what you can do. So there's a little bit of that in Lane. And I think she also has curiosity, and she also has a real drive for justice. When she sees that something is wrong, someone's been hurt, or someone's been accused of something that she's very certain they didn't do, she really wants to see if she can help. So it's that kind of combination, and luckily she's very, she's close with the inspector of the local area. In fact, she marries him, and he actually, although he makes a lot of quips about her, he actually respects what she brings to the table. So I would say those are the motivations for Lane.
Thank you. Charles, you're Dr. Boudreau.
Yeah.
Mostly she's dealing with her clients, going far past the expectation of client, patient
Right.
relationships. So why does she go too far?
Dr. Boudreau's motivation, I would say, is kind of the same motivation she brings to the treatment of her patients, but just kind of transposed into a different setting. So that she is this person with a very particular and particularly intimate understanding of her patients that is kind of accessible only to her and only through this relationship that she has with them, that comes through kind of a combination of similarly to Lane, like this this wellspring of skill, coupled with just a kind of character that's drawn to looking out for the people who are in her charge. And in the first book, in Primary Obsessions, there's basically one of her patients is essentially being railroaded, but also allowing himself to be railroaded. And the combination that allows that to be possible is one of kind of ignorance on the part of the sort of legal structure, but then also just guilt on the part of the patient. And so she has to kind of insert herself into the investigation, or feels that she has to insert herself into the investigation. And it's just kind of the question of like how well does someone who is very smart and very analytical in the field that they're trained in fare in something that they aren't.
Thank you.
In your case, Dave Wakeland is a PI. There's a certain expectation of danger, but he always goes far past what is expected. Often when his clients even dismiss him, and he just can't let it go. So what drives Dave?
Well, I think, that's very perceptive of you. It's, his motivations are really sort of like an iceberg, where on the surface it's money. I mean, this is a job, as anyone who lives in Vancouver and has to pay rent here knows, unless you make $2,200 a month, you're going to be out on the street. So he has to, accomplish and get what his clients want. Often that is a very corporate type job that he's not too pleased to do, but once in a while he'll get a client that he believes in. And that's where the lower part of the iceberg comes in, where he has this sense that things in the city aren't right. He's had kind of a tumultuous family life. So any sort of missing person case kind of just triggers something. And he's a bit of an obsessive. So once there's that absence or that thing that he can't quite figure out, then it's just, almost compulsive to get to the truth.
In your most recent book, Hell and Gone, it's not even his case.
Right.
But he doesn't have much choice, really, but he could do less.
Yeah. I mean, this is a book where at the outset, Wakeland is just a bystander, and he happens to witness this very horrific act of violence, this robbery which spills out into the streets. People get shot, and like a good Samaritan, he rushes in, remembers his St. John's ambulance training, the ABC, everyone knows, airway, breathing, cardiac. It's cardiac. And saves someone's life. So he's a hero for about 10 seconds. And then he makes the classic mistake of going that one extra step too far, goes into the building where the robbery started, and sees something that's so horrific to him that when he walks out and the police show up and they ask what happened, all he says is, look, I didn't see a fucking thing. Pardon my swearing, but no, we're crime writers. We can swear. So that his initial impulse is to sort of wipe his hands and just stay out of it. But there is that little, voice in the head that just says, you're not going to be able to get any peace until you figure out what happened and get some sense of justice or balance to things.
You said something in there about the classic went too far. And I was thinking about this with this panel, the difference sort of between reality and fiction, and the rules that we live in fiction. So Charles, in your last book, at one point she's being chased and her life is threatened.
Right.
But she doesn't give up. So do you think maybe that's sort of a line? Obviously, the protagonist has to pursue the case or it wouldn't be a book.
Yeah.
But do you think we'd start blowing the line of reality? Because I think most doctors at that point would have been like, oh, hands clean.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Anik, the compromise with reality is more like, I spoke to a friend who is a psychologist and who really kind of got into the books, and so we were having a talk about them this summer, and she really was quite enthusiastic, and but then also was saying, of course, and she was referring to the first one, she said, of course, in that situation, that would be a case where she could break the confidentiality and just say something to the police because, the well-being of her client is clearly being compromised, right? But I have to make her commitment to his privacy as a patient kind of, borderline fanatical, in order both to serve the story, but also to serve her as a character. And my feeling with her is, in terms of who I imagine her to be, and Anik is kind of the starting off point for Anik is a real life psychologist who I've seen for many years, and I don't know how that real life person would respond, but I don't imagine her leaving after things got and I definitely I don't imagine Anik hitting that kind of big moment of terror. I remember one time seeing somebody being roughed up outside of an apartment where I was living. It's like 21 years old, and I went down, and then the guy who was doing the roughing up then kind of implied that he had a gun. And then, I had the thought process of like, well, so am I just willing to come down and help? Like, oh, but now that I know that you're in real trouble, I don't help. Like, so I do think that people who find themselves, once you've bought into the idea that you're going to help, I think there is a point where you've bought into the idea that you're committed to saving this person who you're trying to save, and so yeah, I feel like the compromises with reality are more mundane. I don't feel like there's so much in those big moments where I think actually people are a bit more kind of heroic in those everyday moments than they're usually given the opportunity to be.
Iona, in your case, Elaine, this time, it's not even in her home turf. She goes to, I thought New Denver was fictional, but I had to look it up, and it's like, oh, this is a real place in BC. So she leaves Nelson or Kings Cove, travels probably about 100 miles.
It's more like 50 maybe,
Sure, but still far.
but on really bad roads.
On the old days too.
Yeah.
She doesn't have Darling with her, and she involves herself in another case. So what compelled her to not just come home?
I think two things. One is that this character is inspired by my mother, and my mother always went too far. She, as an example of my mother, when I was 3 and my brother was about 12, she decided she was tired of being left behind by my father because he did geology. She decided she would hitchhike to Alaska with truck drivers. And that's what she did. She left me and my brother with an old lady who I can barely remember except for the hem of her skirt because I was very small. And she hitchhiked with truck drivers, interstate truckers, who did things like play chicken on the road with other oncoming truckers and things like that. So, Lane, by comparison, is, I think, very staid. And I think Charlie's absolutely right that I think, and I think it's what gives the reality here, is that someone who's going to help, once they've committed to it, won't just walk away. I think the compulsion, once you've started, is that you're going to keep going. And so I think that very much is in Lane's mind, she will see it through to the end.
Yeah, I think, again, verging on fiction and reality, that probably is real, though. I think most of us agree with you.
I mean, I'm not sure I'd ever do those things,
But I think we, as human beings, we follow through. And if we see somebody in danger, I completely agree with you. Once you commit to,
That's
Their
where the
well-being.
decision is. Do
Yeah.
I commit or not? Like,
Yeah.
like, am I going to invest in this thing? And I do feel like every day we make the decision not to invest. Like that is very real. But I do think that once we do, there is a point where you just, in for a penny, in for a pound.
Yeah.
Which is I just coined that.
Very clever.
Just kind of thought, yeah.
So English.
I'm going to write that one down.
Yeah. It's not even the currency I use on a day-to-day basis, but.
I agreed that we'll do some short readings, so let's take some breaks. But before we do, any questions from the audience at all about our protagonists, our heroes? I got one.
Yeah, well, just from the point of view of the reader, I was thinking of Sam's point, how he starts the book, and I just wondered, did you build in this, what he saw and then what he rejected about telling the investigating policeman? Did you build in this sense of irony, which is also a nice book for the reader? Is that a conscious thing, or is that a kind of natural flow for your way of putting it together?
So the question was, did I build in a sense of irony into Helen Gone in the beginning with the main character refusing to get involved in this case? And really it all, like, to me, it all comes out of the character and his decisions. So with Wakeland, I see him as kind of the Vancouver Jim Rockford, if you've ever seen the Rockford Files. If you're not...
By a great author.
Yeah.
Stuart Kaminsky.
If you're not a million years old like me, Jessica Jones, I guess, is the most current PI. But a private eye who's kind of on the side of the underdog. That's sort of the character type. But with Helen Gone, I wanted to put that character into a situation that was so beyond anything he'd seen before that he was actually traumatized by it. So now to solve the case, he not only has to, sort out what happened, why, all the sort of mystery stuff of the plot, but also his own fear and trauma connected to that. And I think that with men, especially kind of tough guys and, that style of literature, it's not very common for characters to admit that they're afraid or to come up with something where, at the beginning at least, his answer is like, nope, this is way too, scary for me. There's no upside for me to do this. I would love to know why, but I'm not willing to dive for an answer. And then to just put him in circumstances where slowly the rug is pulled out from under him and he realizes that unless he confronts this, he's not going to be able to move on. So I hope that answers the question. So it's not so much the irony, but it's picking a situation where the character will reveal something of their inner self. It's a great question.
Which Sam repeated for the people at home watching on the live streams, just in case that seemed insane.
That's how I answer everything.
Yeah.
Sam, on that note, would you let me read a little bit?
All right, sure. I'm going to read the first chapter of Helen Gone. It's very brief, and this will drop you right into the book. There's a little bit of violence, but I hope that you're... I don't think it's too graphic. Fireworks let off indoors. At first, I thought I might have drifted off, and the sound belonged to the tail end of some already dispersing dream. 5:15 in the goddamn morning, and I'd been up all goddamn night. I'd driven back from Hope in the early hours, chasing down a scaffolder who'd moved north owing 5 months' child support. He'd been drunk and quarrelsome, and it had taken some bare-knuckle convincing, but he'd paid. Instead of going home and waking up Sonia, I'd driven to the office. The plan had been to write up my report, make tea, and fall asleep in whichever order those things happened to come. The half-finished document lay in front of me, and if I dozed off, it was only for a second. The small office was still, the only sound the burble from the Zojirushi heating water for tea. Quiet, too, outside, with dawn just breaking behind the new office towers of Chinatown. I could hear the diesel drone of a vehicle idling in the street and the groggy gabble of commuters waiting for the first bus of the morning. The office was on the 3rd floor of a brick tenement on Kiefer Street, surrounded by larger, newer, prefab structures. The office window was wedged open with a copy of Kim Rossmo's Criminal Investigative Failures. Over the frame, with its trench of pigeon spikes, I had a view of the 6-story office building across the street. Locals had christened it Gentrification Central. A panel van idled to the left of the building's entrance. Late 90s vintage, painted a lusterless black, exhaust dribbling from its tail. The engine made guttural sounds like the phlegm-clearing horks of a smoker. The windows were tinted so I couldn't see inside. I heard it again, the muffled boom of fireworks coming from inside the building across from me. Ripples of sharp bass echoes, erratic, that could be felt through the morning air. Then heavier sounds that grew louder till they shook the panes of the glass-fronted lobby, a shattering sound. Then nothing but the rev of the van and a chirp of confusion from the bus stop. During the lull, I noticed the fissures in the glass doors. Not fireworks. Maybe I'd known from the jump. I have some experience with violence. I fetched my shoes from the front door and shut off the zojirushi, abandoning my mug with a string of twinings wound around the handle. As I laced one shoe, I glanced out the window and saw a figure emerge from the building, soon trailed by others. Each of them was dressed in the same deep blue janitor's coveralls, their faces masked, thick gloves on their hands. The first figure out held a pump-action shotgun and walked calmly to the van as if he were guarding it. He changed direction as he noticed the 2 commuters who'd ventured into the street. Black neoprene covered the bottom of his face, the bleached jaws and fangs of a skeletal dog stenciled over his mouth. His hair was dark brown and cut short, and when he spotted the commuters, he swung the barrel of the shotgun toward them. I felt the breath steal from my lungs. The commuters had first made a communal sound, almost a swoon, that in the aftermath broke into separate sounds of panic and agony and fear. A male voice stuttered and sobbed as a keening rose up from the street, a sharp slurp of breath from someone in pain. During all of this, I hadn't moved from the window. One shoe still dangled stupidly from my fingers. I became aware of it, blinked, let it fall to the office floor. I muttered to myself words that felt empty and inadequate even as I mouthed them, "Oh shit, what am I going to do?" I have some experience with violence, nothing like this. I forced myself to breathe, then I went out the window. Thank you.
Publishers always tell us to start strong, so well done.
Thank you.
Let's talk then about our antagonists. Obviously, we have to keep it vague because we don't want to give away the end of your books. But a lot of times in fiction, the motive of our bad guys is typically either love or greed or money. Those 2 spectrums. Do you think as fiction writers, can we venture out of that? Or does it no longer become believable if our killers kill for random reasons?
Can I
Please.
talk a little bit? My brother is a neuroscientist, and he told me a number of years ago that they've done a lot of experiments with people who have certain kinds of just very mild brain damage. It could be from birth or getting hit on the head in a baseball game or whatever. And one of the things they've discovered is that they can test for people who have difficulty making decisions. And so if the person lives their whole life without ever having to confront something really difficult, they can have a perfectly normal life. But there's a category of people who, when confronted with the real difficulty, can't think of anything else but to try to get out by doing something like killing somebody, right? It's like that's all they can think of. And that really impressed me because I think in real life you see killing and you do think why, you really want to see some grander, I mean, in Sam's world, you've got crooks who are after money and they're drug dealers and all of that. But I think also the world is full of people who just don't know how to cope. And so in my antagonist, if I may then carry on, here you've got a guy who, the initial killing in the book is because a guy is confronted with something he doesn't like. He's confronted by a person who, whose people he's prejudiced against. And he doesn't want to cope with, and it's like, get off my line, bang, that's it. And then the other person who reels around dangerously in this book is motivated by kind of messed up family, and wanting to, to resolve like really painful issues in her life with her father. So you've got the psychology, but you've also got the just why kind of question.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think I would say almost in the 80s, if our serial killer was a serial killer because they're serial killers, which is probably very realistic, it wouldn't go now. Like, you couldn't just say at the end of your book, the person's a serial killer. They just killed out randomly. It wouldn't really work in crime fiction. I'm wrong. If there's a book that I recently came out that proves me wrong, I apologize, but I can't think of one off the hat. So where do you find yourself, whoever wants to speak,
Sure.
Do you find yourself sort of limited through the expectations that your bad guy has to have these strong motivations, strong enough to kill?
I mean, I look at it like I wouldn't want to base the book around a crime that I couldn't commit, as silly as that sounds. So it's, not that I'd want to murder someone, but whatever the impetus is behind it, I'd want it to be something that's not foreign to my experience of humanity. So in Helen Gone, and I won't give away the conspiracy, but there's a real parallel between the police and the organized crime group that Wakeland ends up crossing. And one of the things that he realizes is that this murder, this really public act of violence, spilled out because of very strong institutional, trying to cover your ass, trying not to get, your mistakes publicized, trying to protect people you care about. And there's a real parallel between that. So, the killer himself or herself might be motivated by something, in the moment. But what sets it in motion are forces that I think affect all of us.
Yeah, I mean, whatever it turns out to be has to be more satisfying than whatever the kind of red herrings are, or whatever the kind of most plausible theory going in is. And your most plausible theory, the plausible kind of working theory that starts shaping up has got to be pretty compelling for it to drive your story. So you're gonna at least make it that much more satisfying than that theory. And so I think finding some sort of genuine human motivation is really the only way to scratch that itch. And I think, in my case, I have the added complication of, because I'm writing about mental illness, but the mental illness, I mean, in a lot of the reviews that came out about both books, and this wasn't necessarily something that I was trying to do when I was trying to write about a world that I knew very well, because I'd been in cognitive behavioral therapy for a very long time. I knew that there had already been, an OCD detective and monk and stuff like that. But I thought, well, what if the detective was my psychologist? And I thought every book could sort of orbit around a particular mental illness that her, the first book was about obsessive compulsive disorder. This book is about depression. But a lot of the reviews said, mental illness has been used as this kind of lazy catch-all in in crime fiction so often that it's nice to see it treated in a kind of humane way in these stories, which also means that I then can't go, the killer was somebody who was really crazy, but like really crazy, and so there has to be something that is kind of not necessarily a rational reason for killing someone, because I mean, that's, you're starting to get into pretty dangerous territory. But the sort of reasons that narratively we accept, and you've kind of boiled them down to the ones that we do, right? I mean, people in movies and books kill for love, or money, or power. That those are the kind of big areas.
I want to backtrack a little bit on mine too. One of the reasons my person kills is because he's a racist, and he thinks there's no problem really. And it's 1947, right. And so he feels like eliminating a member of this particular group would not be a problem. So there's that kind of thing too. And for a long time, it wasn't popular to do that. And now we're living in a time when there's, dangerous racism out there where people feel like it's okay. So.
We'll just referring back to your book. I found a little bit of a departure for you in this book, a little bit, because you are dealing with a lot of different races. You have a very interesting character, Tom, in it, and very beautiful conversation at the beginning between Lane and Tom.
Why, I'm planning to read it.
All right, actually, then why don't I let you just read it?
Okay. So the cover of my book shows this moment when Lane is having a lovely little sit down in a meadow, admiring Slocan Lake on a lovely morning, and she sees someone approaching on horseback. And it's been quite interesting. One of my editors sent me a note, a consulting editor, so not with the publisher, saying she was extremely worried about this moment because she could not imagine a woman talking to a strange man. And I was really surprised by that, because I would talk to a strange man. My mother clearly would. It's just, I just thought it was an interesting sidebar about what people are afraid of today, because this woman is much younger than I am. She's in her 40s, and it really alarmed her that a woman would willfully just talk to a stranger. So this is the moment at which they meet, and we see it in the first second from Tom Simpson's point of view. And Tom Simpson is a member of the Sinixt nation, which no longer existed in this part of British Columbia by the time this story starts, because of mining and damming and agriculture and land being given away to settlers. His people just moved to the lower end of their territory, which happened to be in Washington State. But even today, people come back and reconnect with that part of the world that is their home, Simpson could see the clearing up ahead and made for it, figuring he must be close to where they used to come. He thought he could see the corner of a cabin through the trees in the distance. He cleared the edge of the forest and then stopped, uncertain. There was a woman in a turquoise sweater sitting very still in the middle of the meadow he would have to cross. If he could turn quickly and go back into the woods, he could avoid a confrontation. He imagined her being afraid, maybe hurrying away or demanding to know what right he had to be there. He watched her for a moment longer and was about to turn back when she stood up and began to wave. His heart sank. He'd have to go on and deal with whatever it was that was about to happen. He waited to try to gauge her intentions. He did not want to appear to be a threat to her. To his surprise, she called out, "Hello," waving again. Lane watched the horseman, intrigued. He seemed to be appraising her, or perhaps he just didn't want to be bothered socializing with a stranger. She had some sympathy with this view. But then he dismounted. She put her hand over her eyes to block out the sun to see him better. He seemed to be equipped as her neighbor, the prospector, was when he went out on horseback to explore. Saddlebags, bedroll, rifle. He walked up the hill toward her slowly, and she saw that he had a waterproof coat folded and placed behind the saddle. "Hello," Lane called again when he was near enough. He took off his cowboy hat and nodded. He had thick, dark hair combed straight back and a long, narrow brown face and dark eyes. She guessed he was a little over 30. He looked at her and nodded. "Ma'am?" He dropped his horse's reins, patting the side of the animal's neck in a reassuring manner. He turned back to Lane and settled his weight onto one foot, as if waiting to see if more conversation would be required. "Have you come far?" Lane asked, smiling in a way she hoped would put him at ease. She could sense he didn't particularly want to stop and talk. He turned and nodded in the direction he'd come from. "From over the border." "Oh," Lane said, looking in the same direction. "I didn't know one could just ride over like that. My name is Lane Winslow, by the way." She put out her hand. He nodded, took a few steps forward, and took her hand and shook it briefly, not pressing, as if handshaking was not his chosen way of greeting. "Tom Simpson." There was a long pause, and looking past her, he asked, "Do you live here?" "Oh, no, I live miles away by Kootenay Lake. I came to visit a friend, but he's not there, so I thought I'd take a walk before I make the long drive back. Good job I did. It's absolutely beautiful." She looked past him at the horse, which had wandered farther into the meadow and was now pulling up hunks of grass with a sideways motion. "What a beautiful creature." Simpson nodded and offered a slight smile, his face relaxing fractionally. "That's Rocky. He waited a long time for me to come home. Now he pretends he doesn't even know me." Lane smiled. "I remember some rather aloof horses my sister had when we were young. I see you have the badge of the 104th. Did you serve with them?" Simpson put his hand up to his collar. "Yes, ma'am, Europe." He was surprised she recognized it. He wasn't completely sure why he still wore it. Perhaps it was just a continuation of that adjustment from warrior to civilian. Most people wouldn't have recognized it. Lane was a little sorry she'd opened the subject, as she was not entitled to speak about her own war. "I worked in an office in London. I remember seeing the insignia and admiring it, that it looked like a lone wolf." He gave a little smile. "I guess that's why I liked it too. Are you visiting someone?" He shook his head and hesitated, as if considering whether he should explain. "I came up here in the summer when I was a kid. Our people used to live around here." "I'm not sure how far the border is from here, but I expect you've been writing for some time. I have a box of chocolate biscuits I brought for my friend. We might as well eat them." She sat down and patted the stone next to her. Simpson put his hat back on and hesitated for a moment, looking toward the settlement. He couldn't remember a time when a stranger, a white woman, had asked him to sit down and eat cookies. He had a sudden thought that his grandmother would greet this unusual situation by saying, sit down and eat the damn cookies." Here, end of the reading.
Yeah, and then they go on to have a beautiful conversation. One line, I'm going to get it slightly off, but we don't own the land, the land owns us. Something on those lines.
Yes,
It's
yes.
really
And that
beautiful
actually
line.
came directly from the woman with whom I work very closely on this book, Marilyn James, who is is considered the mother of the autonomous Sinixt. And I saw a film clip of her actually before I actually went and met her. And she said that one thing. And I just thought it was so right that we don't own the land, it owns us. We belong to it.
Mm-hmm. Time is going very fast. So let me ask you one really quick question, Charles, and then let's do your reading.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, before I do that, any hands? All right. For you, it almost sounds like, well, this is your second story.
Yeah.
It's almost a new hat for you to wear because you're quite established as a comedian. What draws you to wake up in the morning and say, you know what, I'm going to write some serious shit today?
Yeah, I mean, I've been writing. The writing precedes the comedy, I think. It's fair to say, but not the crime writing for sure. Not the. And I always feel like the writing and the comedy come from a very similar place. though the place where that's closest is in the nonfiction writing. So in the kind of essay form is where there's the least sort of sorting into different piles. And when you are sitting down to write fiction, that's probably the furthest thing from writing stand-up in terms of stretching. And then in terms of writing mystery, I've written, Noonday Dark is my fourth novel. The first book I ever wrote was a very literary, plotless, kind of language-driven novel. And then in 2016, I had a kind of crime comedy, like a sort of, it was sort of a satirical called Property Values. And,
Great book, by the way.
Great book.
Thank you very much.
Great book.
Thank you.
My mom's favorite. She really liked it.
Oh, that's very sweet. And so Primary Obsessions and Noonday Dark were something very new in the sense that, and something very intimidating in the sense that mystery felt like, even more so than crime, mystery is a genre where the expectations are far clearer. The readership is very well educated in terms of what they can expect from the book, what some of the rules are about the game, and there's just like, I mean, you've heard it today, right? I mean, there's a lot of great stuff that's out there, and you'll end up sitting on panels with people who you then have to read next to, and so it's a harrowing kind of thing, and in terms of why, that's a good question. But I thought it would be a fun world to be in through the eyes of this through the eyes of this character, based on this person who I have this deep respect and a kind of love for, this psychologist who really kind of saved my life. And I was at a festival years ago, and there was a poet who was reading poems that she had written about a therapeutic relationship, and a long-term relationship with a therapist is a really, it's just a very unique kind of human relationship, because it's this person who knows things about you that some of the most intimate loves of your life, dear family and friends, will never know about you, and they've seen you through these darkest places, and you don't know when their birthday is, and you'll never know when their birthday is. You don't know what their partner's name is, and it would be weird if you asked. I just thought it would be really neat to get to write this and kind of live in this world and get to do something that took place over the course of more than one book. And that has been really fun to work with an editor. If you get to work with the same editor over the course of a couple of books, and then they get to invest in it as well. And, you have, Noonday Dark has a much more of a kind of plot involving Anik's boyfriend and his kind of, his sort of tough guy past. And that was my editor, Caroline, who, there was a bit more of that in the first book. And she said, why don't we hold off on this, and we can get to know Philip a little bit more in a later book. And it was just a great bit of advice, and to know that there would be the time and the space to get to do that. It just felt like a fun, creative outlet. And I don't know that I have anything more kind of articulate to say than that.
It's very well done. Have a glass of water,
Yeah.
because then we have to hear you read.
Okay. I think this is mostly self-explanatory, but Dr. Boudreau's patient, Danielle, who she's treating for a major depressive episode, has gone missing, and they've found an undated suicide note at her apartment, and her estranged father, who is a former left-wing journalist who has become a right-wing blogger, comes to the doctor's office. Still walking towards her from the hallway, the man croaked a question at her, somehow with a heavy valence of confidence, despite its being a question. "You're the shrink? Boudreau?" "I'm Dr. Boudreau." "Ivor McFadden," he said, then gave a wet cough that could have been a smoker's cough or could have been a man trying not to cry. Then, with the same perfectly gruff modulation, he added, "I'm trying to find my daughter." "Why don't you come into my office, Mr. McFadden?" "Ivor. Anik." Ivor nodded stiffly and followed Anik into the office, taking in the details of the room with a journalist's reflexive curiosity as he sat down in the chair where Danielle had sat the previous week. McFadden gave a vague, all-purpose nod, but Anik wasn't sure how she was meant to interpret it because his face seemed to be drawn into something like a permanent squint. "Can I get you anything, Ivor? A glass of water or a cup of coffee, tea?" "Too early in the day to drink anything useful." "Okay," Anik said, smiling softly. Ivor wiped his face with both of his large hands and stared at Anik. It was always an interesting thing when very beautiful women looked a great deal like their fathers. If one knew the father first, it was usually considered at least a little funny, if not slightly unfortunate, for the poor girl. But when Anik and Philip had watched 12 Angry Men, their first sustained exposure to Henry Fonda, neither could get over how pretty he looked, owing to his strong resemblance to Jane. Anik brought the same daughter-first sensibility to Ivor's features and saw the girl's loveliness cast back a generation underneath the silver beard and wild eyebrows of the father, in his cheekbones and on the bridge of his nose, the large and intelligent eyes. Ivor McFadden had been a Vancouver legend, not a founding member of Greenpeace, but a fellow traveler and its bard, an editorialist, but always also a shoe-leather reporter. He had exposed governments, municipal and provincial, brought low federal cabinet ministers, and the deep moral assurance of those years was still written into the lines of his face. "They said my daughter killed herself. I got a phone call from the VPD yesterday telling me that was their assumption. It was an awful call to get. I can't imagine how much worse it was for you. I'm so sorry. They found a suicide note." Anik gave the kind of nod that could have been a confirmation or just empathetic listening. Ivor wasn't put off by the tactic. "I say they found a suicide note." "Yes, I heard you." "What do you make of that?" "I can't imagine how difficult this must be, but it would be inappropriate for me, and I really have no grounds for speculating on an open police investigation." "Open? Open and shut. Girls reported missing by the old lady on the main floor who brings up the mail. They find old empty bottles of antidepressants in the suite. They find a suicide note. How much sniffing around do you think they keep doing after that?" "I don't know," Anik answered, entirely honestly. "Sure. I'll bet there's a lot you don't know. Otherwise, how else does a young woman end up coming in here, giving you however many months of her time, however many hundreds of her dollars, and still somehow she's in a state of popping pills and leaving suicide notes? Mr. McFadden, I can't imagine the pain you must be feeling at the moment. I would ask you, though, to address yourself to that pain, rather than coming into my office and impugning not only my work, but also your daughter from a position of spectacularly splendid ignorance. Is that clear? Erik had seen that look before. The look that appears when two people meeting in a professional context bite down on the hard kernel of shared blue-collar metal. Far from angering or alienating McFadden, Erik's response had clearly passed some sort of smell test for him. But you don't think she killed herself. Listen, I'm not. Don't worry about the confidentiality song and dance. I'm still the goddamn next of kin, for Christ's sake. So we don't, well, talk. Okay, that's not my choice. I'm still her goddamn father, and the institutions of Western liberal democracy haven't eroded into the soup of postmodern relativist whims just yet. And so as the father of a missing young woman, presumed dead by suicide, I'm still entitled to some information from the police department, if not from the inviolable spiral ring notebook of some psychiatrist, all right? Actually, I'm a psychologist. Same thing. Not really, no. Thanks.
I know at the beginning I said we have 3 great writers today. I could have also added 3 great readers. I've had to read in front of an audience before. It's nerve-wracking, and to be honest, sometimes it's quite boring. Sitting listening to an author read their own book, but 3 professionals today. So congratulations to all 3 of you.
Thank you.
I could hear you do your own audiobooks and not turn it off.
Well, that's a blurb I will take today.
We are coming to an end. I can squeeze in a quick question if anybody has one.
I actually have one for Sam, if I may. You write about your therapist.
Yeah.
I write about my mother. Is Wakeland somebody you know?
That was a great question.
Well, I don't know. I mean, Dave Wakeland, this is a book written in the first person. So it's fair to speculate, is the character based on me? And some of the attitudes are, his background's pretty different. And I've changed a few things here and there, but he's not based on any one real person. What I've done is just try to make a character who's interesting and who has a lively interpretation of the city, and then put them in interesting situations. So he's a lot tougher than I am. He's also not as smart in some ways and much, much smarter in others. So no, he's not based on any one person. I wish I could say it's my dad, but my dad was a studio musician. He didn't solve a lot of crimes.
But we should pitch that show, the crime-solving studio musician.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Irish Rovers television show.
Actually, Iona Kent. Outside her
That's
character
right.
is like that. There's a mystery for everyone.
That's right.
Before I let everyone go, I would like to thank the staff and volunteers at Word Vancouver for making this possible. There's plenty of events like this happening today. I'd like to thank Megan, who you can't see, or sorry, those who's online can't see.
Ironically, because that's what she's here for.
And also Bonnie Nish for putting on this whole event. I don't know how she does it. I put on small events. I don't know how she puts on something as big as Word Vancouver, but it takes a lot of volunteers. So thank you very much to everyone who helps out for this festival. Also, I get to do something now that I've been waiting for about 3 years, and I encourage you all to do too. I bought their books. You can go buy their books outside, and I can ask them now to sign them. So I'm going to sign off to everyone watching, but afterwards, though, I'm going to ask you for signed books for the first time in 3 years. So thank you, everyone, for coming out today. Thank you for everyone actually being here today. It's a pleasure. It's so great to be having live events, and thank you, Word Vancouver.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for me to be